energy content information, consumer choices of Australian fast food restaurants. He has 35 minutes, and then we have 10 minutes for questions. And do you want everyone to ask questions as you go?
Clarifying.
Yes, clarifying questions are fine, but everything else go to the end. And it's recorded, so be nice to him.
Thanks, Maxim. Okay, so so it is about this talk is about investigating would consumers change their decisions if we give them information about the energy content of the food. So a bit of just broad context is that a significant majority of the Australian population, or the adult population, is overweight. And if we look at the child population, that's defined as the under 15s, we see again emerging trends of either overweight or obesity. The numbers for WA are a little bit worse than the numbers for Australia. So we do have this background context that says significant proportion of the population is overweight or obese. Healthway is a government-funded agency that is engaged in promoting a healthy lifestyle and does fund research in this area. So that's where the money for this study came from. What do we know about this idea of providing consumers with energy content information? This has a long history in the packaged goods market. We go to the supermarket, it's very clear, we see this energy content labelling information. The one standout category that's not covered is alcohol products, but in Australia we still require an additional level of information to be provided on alcohol products, which is the standard drink content. That's something that you don't see in any other jurisdiction pretty much around the world. So in Australia we do have this culture of saying, okay, we do have packaged goods, we do think it's a good idea to tell people the amount of energy embedded in those goods. If we think out of the packaged goods space in the supermarket, the next thing that we might think of is sort of a bit like a commodity style product where you might be able to do this is a fast food restaurant where the meal is pretty much standard. That's the nature of these places. You get, wherever you are in the world, pretty much you get a pretty standard product. So we might think that we do have a history of requiring supermarkets to provide this information. The next sort of area where we might want to extend this legislation may naturally seem to be fast food restaurants. It's also a policy response that's under active consideration in a number of states. And that reason for that active policy consideration is because we have this significant majority of the population that's either obese or overweight. Now, okay, so that's broadly why we might want to think that this is a reasonable topic to consider. If we're economists, we're not really going to be satisfied with that. We don't really we have to have an additional motivation for us to want to intervene in the market. And if I apply my microeconomics concepts, I can come up with a number of motivations that would satisfy that test from an economics perspective. If I think of information or energy content information, I'd say, information, okay, this is non-rival, difficult to exclude. This clearly comes up as a category of product which would be underprovided by the market. So that's a straight, direct application of our concepts from microeconomics. We can see that the market might provide too little information. So we have market failure. So I have just a little thought experiment for you here. I have a range of items I've selected from fast food menus around the state. So this 3-piece feed from KFC, clearly that's going to be a bad thing for you. But I just want you to pick some of these items, see if you know what the energy content of these items is. So just get that in your mind. We've got some various selection, and here's what they actually are. Okay, so I don't want you to tell me.
Just to put it in context, what would be the recommended total kilojoule?
Next point. That's your next thought experiment. Okay, so what we tend to find when we do this, even with dietitians, is that people underestimate meal items and overestimate the energy content of drinks. I don't know where you sat in that, but just keep in mind that you may have got that. In general, we discover that most people get this kind of thing wrong. Bob's question is a very relevant one for this. So, know thyself. Okay, you would have heard, maybe you would have heard this representative number that's thrown out there, 8,700 kilojoules. Now that is what these recommended daily intake numbers work off, but of course that's the representative person. And the actual requirements vary through age, they depend on how active you are, they vary by gender. So again, I want you to think of where you fit in this matrix up here, active, sedentary. Sedentary is most people that work in an office, and through the age spectrum. Just get an idea in your mind of where you think your energy content requirement might be, and that's what it actually is.
Excuse me, as a nutritionist, I would want to correct you. It's not an energy requirement, it's a recommended daily intake, and it corresponds to the demand for energy, not the requirement.
Yeah, okay, all right, we're just using loose language for a presentation. All right, so what you can see again here is that we see that the pattern changes. I think that for my experiment, what this says to me is that it's not quite clear to me what would be the best way to describe information. If I was to describe it as percentage of recommended daily intake, I'm going to be using that 8,700 number and expressing it as a percentage of that. It's not clear to me that that would be the best way to convey information. So I want to explore that. Should I just label this in terms of pure energy content, or should I label this in terms of percentage of recommended daily intake for this representative person? So I think what my point here is really just saying that, look, from an economics perspective, we might think that information is underprovided. That gives us a ground for at least thinking about whether we would have a market intervention. In the economics, and this is also what happens when you ask people. If you ask people what you think is the recommended daily energy intake number, you get 2 peaks. And I think that all that's happening there is that people are confusing calorie measurements and kilojoule measurements, because what I've got there with those vertical lines are the representative numbers. The one down at around 2,000, that's a measurement in calories, and the one that's over here at 87 is the kilojoule number. Now, I guess what I'm getting at here is that I think that people might be making decisions thinking 2,000 is the right number, or they might be making decisions thinking 87 is the right number. It's just that it's a bit unclear. More generally, there is some confusion in the marketplace. So maybe there's a value for information. In the economics literature, timing consistent preferences is a theme that comes up in modern applications that is a grounds for market intervention. So this is the idea that we need the government to save us from ourselves. We are exhibiting timing consistent preferences so that if we had some syntax, it would actually be helpful to us. Now, those of you that are from the school are probably well aware that this is not the kind of argument that I'm going to be particularly happy with. I think that we have enough grounds for the state to intervene in markets. I don't particularly find this line of reasoning particularly helpful, but it's definitely a big one out there that could be the justification for getting involved in the market. A third one, which is, again, I feel more in the tradition of economics, would be the externality cost argument. So some people in the health literature have gone out there and said, what are the excess costs to the health system of the obese and overweight population relative to having a population that was in a healthy weight range? And you get big numbers. That's an annual cost of over $10 billion. Not everyone in economics would necessarily agree with the methodology that's used to derive these numbers in the health literature. Fortunately for us, we have John Freeban over at University of Melbourne that's had a go at thinking about just the costs that, from an economics perspective, we would be pretty happy about thinking as externality costs. And in John's thinking, he actually says, externality costs depend on whether the individual is the correct decision-making unit to think about, or whether the family unit is the correct decision-making unit to think about. And that has a big impact on what you would define as an externality cost. Although that's there, regardless of which way you think about this, you will always come up with some externality cost that, no matter how you think about the philosophical question of the individual or the family, whichever way you slice this up, you're going to include these costs. And these are the health costs that fall on the public purse. They are the lost tax revenue to government from productive activity. And because we have to fund the public healthcare system to this additional amount, we have the deadweight loss introduced by additional taxes to fund that. You can see that when people have looked at this, they find the deadweight loss effect of the additional taxes is quite high. So what we've got here is, no matter which way you slice this, you don't get $10 billion, but you've still got $3 billion. You've got a very large sum of money. And then, depending on which way you think about these things, you may or may not care about whether the services provided by a family member to look after someone that's ill are relevant. You may or may not care about the extent of income lost to other members of the family to spend. And you may or may not care about the intangible suffering on other members of the family. What I think is important just to get here is that, not that there's debate about these costs, it's that the bit that there is no debate about is clearly a big number. So we've got a motivation in terms of information content that might be valuable to consumers, and we've got this motivation in terms of an externality cost that falls on society that says, okay, it seems reasonable to start thinking about whether or not we want to intervene in this market. What will we know? So we've got an idea that this might be worth looking at. What do we know? Fortunately, energy labelling comes with a history of good policy. So we go back to the 1990s in the US, you have the FDA, goes about a cost-benefit analysis process, and it looks at the expected health gains from introducing labelling in supermarket products, and the expected cost comes up with a clear case that the expected benefits outweigh the costs. Policy is implemented. Now that took place some time ago, so we've been in a position to reflect back on whether or not that policy actually worked. Remember, we don't actually know that when we've got expected costs, expected benefits. The scenario might not play out as we expect. So we've been in a position where people have actually gone back and said, was that policy a success? And it turns out that the benefits were much greater than those initially estimated by the FDA. So we've had, when this took place, 20 years, enough time to look at whether or not the policy was effective, and the clear conclusion is that it was. Now I think the FDA has a very conservative approach for these evaluations. I feel comfortable with that approach, but in this paper they explore some other ways of measuring benefits and get much bigger numbers. The core message is unchanged. Regardless of how you look at it, the benefits clearly stacked up. From my own perspective, I'm interested in this value of information proposition, and we have another paper again with some research funded by the FDA, which is a very, very interesting experiment, and looked at the value in terms of consumer surplus when we give people information and how they change their decisions. And I've picked the market where we saw the biggest change in the US, which was in the milk market. You had a radical shift from full fat products to half and half products in the US. And we can get some measure of the value of the consumer surplus from that change, the value delivered through information. And again, you can see just for that one small market segment, okay, it was the segment that had the biggest impact, that the benefits to the consumer far outweigh the estimates of the costs. So when we've looked at this process in terms of other markets, we see that this policy might be successful. So we've got some genuine reason to think that we should at least seriously look at this proposition. In terms of fast food market, there is some conflicting literature about whether or not it has an effect or not. I would point to one study which I think meets the gold standard of any kind of study. These guys convinced Starbucks to give them their sales data. So you've got loyalty cards, right? So you've got every individual and you know their exact transactions on that card. You have a policy intervention in New York State. You have control cities. So you can track sales in cities, unique individuals, tens of millions of transactions. Track this through time. Policy intervention, New York State, nothing happens in any of the controls. It's very clear that there's an effect. And that effect is sustained going forward. That's about a 6% fall. All right, now, of course you have so many data observations, everything's statistically significant, but I would argue that the 6%, it's in the drinks market, okay, it's not trivial. It's a small market, and the idea here is that if we can sustain these small changes, we might have some benefits to the health system. And the way I would, when I look at, there's a variety of approaches in the health economics literature for valuation of these things. If we just think of this person progressively not adjusting their energy intake through time, and they gradually drift through the process of being in the healthy weight bin, into the overweight bin, and into the obese bin, if we can have some small effect, not saying that we would change that pattern, but we might just delay it a bit. And in terms of health system costs, if we can delay the process just a little bit, because those costs are so high, we might actually have some benefits. So we're not actually saying this has to be a big change. We're just saying that maybe it can have some effect at the margin, and given the scale of these costs, some effect at the margin may have some benefit for us. So that's where I think the state of the literature brings us up to. Could it matter? I'm saying that at the margin, this is the distribution of how frequently people report at eating at a fast food restaurant. Okay, so we have our representative person about once a month, but we have a significant proportion of that distribution reporting that they eat weekly or more often at a fast food restaurant. So what I'm suggesting is for a significant proportion of the distribution, they are making meal choices in fast food restaurants on a frequency that is high enough for us to think there's at least the potential for this kind of policy to have some impact. What are my specific research questions? So I want to understand if we give people information about the energy content of these items, will it change their decisions? I also want to know, will their spending change? So in the health literature, they don't really care about whether spending changes, but coming at this from the economics perspective, we would like to understand what are the economic consequences of this kind of policy. Does it matter if you use a % of recommended daily intake format, or whether you display this information in just direct kilojoules? Are there any systematic variations by things like gender? In terms of menu format, the question I'm interested in is if you default by giving people a meal combo option, as it seems to be called, or whether you set up the menu to allow individual menu items to be selected. Does that matter? And again, like I say, does spending matter? So they're broadly the research questions that I'm looking to answer. It's that first one that is in fact the main thrust of what I'm looking at. How did I go about answering this question? I have an online survey, recruit 1,600 people. I have 6 different menus, sort of representative of the fast food flavours that you can get out there, and within that I have these different menu combinations of whether the default is a meal combo or the default is individual menu items. 3 information conditions, no information, RDI and kilojoules, and I get 3 responses from each individual. Okay, so they look at 3 menus, information condition is held constant, and hopefully I can make that clear to you with this little illustration. What have I got here? I've got, this is the survey structure just for illustrating on the screen. I've restricted it to say I've got 3 menus. Okay, I really have 6. The first person comes into the survey, they're randomly allocated to the menus, they pop up, the sequence is random, but the information condition is held the same. The next person that enters the survey would again randomly allocated to the different menus, but information condition the same, and so on. Now, I thought about the experimental design for this. I settled on this approach. You could argue that you might have a more efficient design. From my perspective, that doesn't matter, because when I worked out what sample sizes I needed to detect what I considered a practically important difference, I needed a sample size of about 600, right? So I've got a sample size of 1600. So I can actually detect differences that I don't think will be meaningful. It's just that my funding allowed me to, I took as many, the sample as big as my funding would allow me to, which was more than I needed. So I didn't necessarily have to be too worried about, have I got the most efficient design in the world? It wasn't a problem for me. So what have I got? One thing I will make clear here is that, so this is the Excel file I sent the people that created the survey for me. The menu items are generic. Ethics approval came back. I wanted to put McDonald's and Hungry Jack's on my surveys, and ethics thought that that wasn't necessarily a good idea. So we had to have a slightly more generic form of these items, but the prices I collected by visiting the different fast food chains, and the same with the energy content information. So the actual dollar spend and the kilojoule content is stuff that is real. The descriptions are slightly more generic. That wasn't ideal, but that's what we worked with. And that just gives you an idea of some little section so you can see what kind of information is being transmitted. So what is our model proposition here? We have, I'm going to have a energy content model, which is going to look at how much energy people, of the average energy content of the menu items selected. I'm going to have a bunch of control variables or explanatory variables. Information condition is the thing that we're primarily interested in. I have repeat measures on individuals, so there are some specific things I need to take account of there in having repeat measures. I'm also probably going to have some correlation in the error term of people's selections across menus, and also any sort of cross-section sample probably likely to have some heteroscedasticity issues in the data. And if you find yourself with sort of this proposition of a model and you were to attack the literature and look at what you would find there's a whole range of different models that you might look to use. Okay, if we were in the economics literature, we see things like a random effects panel data model. If we're in the sciences, we might see mixed effects model. Some other literatures call this a linear hierarchical model. All of these crazy terms, right? And what I think is that it's very confusing, but we can kind of simplify this down into two competing streams of the way you might look at this data. Both streams have some strengths, and I try and draw on the strengths of both of those streams. So I've got here my characterization of, if I go through all of this mess, try and order what are all these people talking about, I come up with sort of two approaches. The first one is the economic approach, where we go out, we get some data, we're really worried about consistency in our estimates, we don't run experiments, we don't make distributional assumptions, so we're worried about consistency. So the first kind of model we would estimate is a least squares dummy variable model. We would then say, okay, can we improve on that? Can we get a more efficient model where we go for feasible GLS? And then that would, if we would check that with some sort of Houseman test, say, okay, can we get a more efficient model? Having got the most efficient model consistent with the data, we would then use theory to guide our model selection. We're not too worried if things are statistically significant or not. We use theory, and that's what we appeal to. When we would go to hypothesis testing, we would use robust standard errors, and these are now all flavours that you might ever need are programmed in Stata, and because we're in economics, we would definitely be using Stata. And then in the case that I have, where we want to do multiple comparisons, we would go what? All right, we'd essentially make no adjustments for multiple comparisons, which would be a flaw. The other stream of all this literature, I think, can be characterised as starting with you designed an experiment. And because you designed an experiment, you don't have to worry about consistency. So you jump straight to some sort of efficient estimation of the model. And rather than feasible GLS, you would go for something like restricted maximum likelihood. Okay, which is a slight tweak on maximum likelihood. You would, because you're using maximum likelihood, you would then spend a bit of time looking directly at the covariance matrix structure. You would look at autocorrelation and heteroscedasticity, and you would get all of that stuff sitting up there in the likelihood. Right? You would deal with it then rather than dealing with it with robust standard errors. Model selection tends to be much more ad hoc. There is backwards and forward selection seems to be acceptable, much less reliant on theory. Hypothesis testing naturally flows with our standard errors are okay because we've solved all of those problems up here in our comprehensive model. And then when we want to do multiple comparisons, we would use appropriate adjustments for those. So I think that there are different strengths and weaknesses in these approaches, and I sort of blend them together for the results that I'm going to pick. I say, okay, we get the data, whether it's an experiment or not, I go through and I establish consistency. Having established consistency, I then go for an efficient estimate of the model. I use maximum likelihood, or I use restricted maximum likelihood to estimate this. I deal with the autocorrelation issues and the heteroscedasticity up here in the likelihood function, and I feel that that gives me a better treatment of the problem rather than just relying on some claim of robustness that really at the heart of those robust claims, not necessarily things you would be comfortable with. I get my covariance matrix structure right. I use theory. I think it's important to use theory to guide this. Don't be too worried if things are statistically significant or not, but at the same time it's okay to drop some variables, have some practical decision-making rules. I'm okay with my standard errors for my testing, and when I want to do multiple comparisons, I draw on the experimental literature and go for contrast specifications. So rather than dropping a dummy variable and making no adjustment for multiple comparisons, I treat that in the way that is common in the experimental literature. So that's what I think is actually a good combination of trying to draw on the strengths of the economic approach, but also drawing on this other literature that's grounded in experiments and that does some things, clearly does some things better than we do them in economics. All right, key results here. What do you get? I'm trying to make this easy to read. What do I find? I find that when you present information about the energy content of menu items, we see no impact for females, and we do see a small reduction in the energy content of the menu choices of males. It doesn't matter which way you present this information. And again, if I look at the spend, you see there's a slight reduction in the amount of money that males spend, no reduction in the amount of money that females spend. So that's actually the central thing from all of that modelling. That's the core finding that I was driving at, or the key thing that I think is of interest for public policy. I investigate a whole series of subsequent smaller hypotheses. So it didn't matter whether you present people as a default as a burger, Coke and fries, or if you let them choose their menu items separately, that doesn't seem to matter. Females, we're not getting any effect. Males, we do seem to be getting some effect. So this 190 kilojoule per menu selection decrease. So is it even conceivable that that could matter? So what do we have? We have nearly 30% of males reporting that they eat fast food at least once a week. So if I took 190 kilojoules, multiply it by the number of weeks, convert it into fat, I get 270 grams of fat per year. And so then I've got a whole series of big ifs. If there was no substitution, and if this impact was sustained, yes, it is reasonable to think that you might be slowing the weight gain for some people. And what I would say is that if I look at that, and if I look in some of the studies in the health economics literature, I can get some measure of the value of health costs per BMI point. Right, so for every increase in the BMI point, there are some studies suggesting a number of about, if we put it in current Australian dollars, about $200 per point per year. And what I'm saying is, even if you affected a very small number of the population, so what have we got? People over 15 in Australia, about, what, 18.4 million people. I'm saying if 10,000 people, if only 10,000 were one BMI point lower a year, that would generate net present value of savings of around $18 million. And to be clear, I'm discounting it pretty hard. Okay, I think people actually tend, if you're the government, you might use a discount rate that's quite different to that. But if we're talking people, let's go for something, say 10% real, I think is a pretty hard discount rate to take down on this. So I'm saying that, okay, there might be some benefits here. I'm not being too specific, I'm just saying as a reasonable person, you can see some small changes could deliver some big savings. If we look at the value of information side of things, we can again loosely get some insight into the value that this information might provide. So what we find, or what I find, is that when we give people information, the proportion of people that choose a regular soft drink falls, and the proportion of people that choose a diet soft drink increases. So what that says to me is that without information, in the regular soft drink market, there are a range of transactions that take place where the marginal benefit to the consumer is less than the marginal cost. Right? They're transactions that you would not like to make. So if we're looking at measuring consumer surplus in the case of no information, our true consumer surplus, we've got our thistle-coloured areas minus the green area. The green area is representing those transactions that take place where the marginal benefit to the consumer is less than the marginal cost. And because the marginal benefit is less than the marginal cost, it's detracting from total consumer surplus. But if we're interested in how consumer surplus would change with information, we have to take account of those transactions where the marginal benefit is less than the marginal cost, and we get those back. And we also get these other transactions that take place in the diet soft drink, those extra transactions that didn't take place, but that now do generate consumer surplus. So we have these two triangles as the areas that define the change in the consumer surplus. And if we make some assumptions about the demand for these drinks, you can actually get a guess about what those that area that's represented by the consumer surplus is. So I have Abby and Joe have this very nice study on demand for soft drinks. I'm going to say, let's not even be too exact. I don't think that anyone would object to me saying that, or anyone from the economics profession would necessarily object to me saying that I'm pretty sure that the elasticity for these drinks is going to lie between -0.5 and -1.5. Right, we have some really good studies that are good estimates of that, but let's just say it's going to fall within that range. So let's take that as our range. I then have information on the price of these things, these transactions that take place in restaurants, and I have some information about how decisions change for my representative consumer based on my sample information. I can then combine all of those things, assume a linear demand curve, because it's easy to work out the area of a triangle, and get an estimate of the value of information in terms of the consumer surplus that's delivered. And okay, it's a big range, but it's $34 to $100 million. These are big numbers. So if I also go through this process, I can get some idea of the cost it would impose on business. I make some estimates of the cost that would be imposed on business. I make some estimates of the value of information. I'm not doing this very precisely. My idea is not to do it precisely. My idea is to build up enough evidence to say that it's pretty clear that there are some gains here. I've only done it for drinks. If we do it for other elements of the market, it's not clear to me that they would be additive, but there is going to be some positive value in terms of changes in consumer surplus. I'm not doing anything definitive about saying that this change would definitely have this big impact on individuals in terms of health costs. but I think it's pretty reasonable that there would be some balance, would be some benefit. So what I'm saying is, if you look at all the sources of the benefits, this seems like they're going to build up to a number that's going to be bigger than the costs. And my central thrust from that is, even though I haven't defined things clearly, I haven't gone into great detail to try and get them exact, I've used representative cases to build up the weight of evidence that I think suggests it's probably likely to be a reasonable policy. So my qualifiers to that are, yes, my data is from an experiment, but I do some other testing about what people say they consume and they spend, and that they seem to match up. So it is an experiment. I try and do my best with what I've got to do with that, and I think it's okay. I think this would be an okay policy. My last point there is, though, that in the broader context, whether or not this is a good public policy is not necessarily going to have, or not necessarily, is not going to have a dramatic impact on the broader obesity problem. But in terms of, are the likely benefits going to outweigh the expected costs, I think the weight of evidence supports benefits over costs. And that's it.
Thank you. Any questions?
So I had a question. You showed that that for men, that men's purchases would go down slightly, if at all. For women, that they would largely stay the same or possibly higher. Why would it be possibly higher, do you think? What do you think the reasoning would be behind that?
So there is some noise in there, and two, we could think about, were people they were relatively informed, and they had a rough idea about some of the things that they think. That's broadly what I think, is that maybe the females were just generally more informed in the first place. But it's just approximate. You knew, and then maybe you get oh, I actually made an error. I knew that was about this. Actually, it's a bit less. But broadly, we've still got quite a bit of noise going there.
Right.
Yeah, just I mean, information is a tricky concept. So people know something before they go in. They then get an information signal from you that they then either assimilate or not. Did you do any tests of whether they'd actually read the information and were aware of it sort of after they'd done the experiment? For me, no. I'm just driving it from the behaviour changed. The proportion, that's something that I looked at. I looked at this once I had the data and saw that, hang on, I formally did a proportions test and found that once you gave them that energy content information, that you get a notable change in the proportion for the diets, and that from there I sort of actually started coming to this value of information. Like, you change, what does that mean? How can we value that? Is there a way to value that? And I think there is. This is very rough, very, very rough. So there could be some individuals who have a good idea, they read the information, and it actually has no effect because they knew that already.
Yeah.
And then there's another group of people, probably mainly male.
Yeah. So yeah, okay. So there's clearly an aggregation issue, because what I've created is a representative consumer that switches once. But yeah, okay. And I mean, for a start, I've got a linear demand which is not consistent with utility maximisation. So, I've got some gaps in here, but I'm just not trying to get to grips with those difficult things. If I can convince you that there is some benefit.
I'm just interested that there was such a small change. I just wonder if it's because some people are just disregarding or knew it already.
Yeah. That would be an interesting, with further research money.
I just had a question about your sample. Who were these 1,600 people? How did you recruit them? Did you look at socio-economic differences and age differences?
Yeah, so it's a representative Australian one. So paid a company, asked for a representative sample, you then get your sample, you check it against the stats. Yeah, it's a representative sample of the adult population.
Isabel.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the age groups, because I have a 20-year-old son who would go and eat anytime McDonald's and all that stuff. So that defies a little bit what you're saying there. And thinking about Starbucks is a very specific socioeconomic group. So I think if you get the money, you can go straight to those where the older traders, the young people do go to find out more about how they impact.
Just in the US, Starbucks is ubiquitous. It's there, and that's the study that I reference that just because I think it's such a very, very well done study. It's the kind of study that I wish I'd published.
James, just looking at this idea that people aren't decreasing their consumption, so we're assuming that this is a fad, yeah, because you eat more calories and you get fat. Is there any parallels with cigarette marketing? So you're going to put pictures on the cigarette packet saying that this is bad for you, and how much of your behaviour has actually changed? How much do you get into protest? I don't care if it's bad for me.
Cigarettes is an interesting one. When you start to looking at valuing consumer surplus, cigarettes is very interesting because you have to, you might do much less with cigarettes. In this, I mean, from the economics point of view, I tend to think more of the information kind of thing, that has some value. And the overweight thing is if there's the externality cost. I'm really much more attracted to the value of information and change in consumer surplus.
The way people take on information?
Yeah, I actually haven't gone through that, other than is it easier to process a percent number, or is it easier to process a raw number? That's probably getting outside the area of stuff that I'm competent to talk about. I probably need to talk to someone from psychology or someone, or the behavioural economists in the room. They might have more of a sense of that kind of stuff. I don't know.
Michael.
So, you got information on how frequently these guys were consuming? That didn't have any effect on the size of the shift?
No, actually.
Thought people who were regular consumers might have bigger impact than those.
Yeah, no is the answer to that. No impact. But it raises the point about we do have some theory drivers for what you might reasonably put in the model, and who cares if they're significant or not? We should reflect that in the model structure.
As a nutritionist, I'd like to congratulate you on your initiative to do this research. But have you thought of doing the same thing with protein? Because this would be a positive thing. You say, you need protein. Everybody needs protein. So you need so much. You have your requirement of protein, and you say you can get so much requirement of protein from your French fries, or you can get much more if you're going to get the fish burger. So that would be a positive thing. It would be much more acceptable to the food industry, I have been associated with the fast food industry, and also it would shift the emphasis from energy, which I think, energy is empty energy. If you're talking about energy without saying how many nutrients there are associated with that energy, is useless. Protein is always associated with other nutrients, such as vitamins, minerals and trace elements. So you can't give the consumer too much information. You can give them only a limited amount of information on menu. So I think that if you repeated the same thing, same experiment with protein, you would have much better responses from the public.
Yeah.
And that I would extend that to the mass catering industry, not just the fast food, all industrial
commodified thing. Because I'm a straight up economist, so I'd be happy to have a chat and learn a bit more about these things.
Thank you. I guess we don't have any more time. If you have any more questions, you can talk to him later. And then we have, let's thank